In the gaslit parlours of Victorian England, a revolution was quietly taking place. Women who had spent years confined to darkened rooms, plagued by mysterious ailments their doctors dismissed as hysteria or nervous exhaustion, were suddenly discovering a miraculous remedy. This wasn't some exotic potion imported from distant lands or an ancient herbal remedy passed down through generations. It was a modern pharmaceutical marvel, prescribed by respectable physicians and sold in elegant glass bottles at chemist shops throughout Europe and America. The drug was laudanum, and by the mid-19th century it had become the aspirin of its age, a cure-all for everything from headaches to heartbreak. But unlike aspirin, laudanum contained a powerful secret ingredient, opium, and for thousands of Victorian women, this medicine would become something far more dangerous than the ailments it was meant to treat. What was laudanum? Laudanum was a tincture of opium dissolved in alcohol, typically containing about 10% powdered opium. The mixture was dark, bitter, and remarkably potent. A single teaspoon could contain as much as 25 milligrams of morphine, the primary active alkaloid in opium. For context, modern pain management protocols consider 15 milligrams of morphine a substantial dose for an opioid-naive patient. The preparation had been around since the 16th century, when the Swiss physician Paracelsus first created a medicinal opium tincture he called laudanum, from the Latin word laudare, meaning to praise. But it was in the Victorian era that laudanum truly came into its own, becoming as common in middle-class households as tea and sugar. Doctors prescribed it liberally for an astonishing array of complaints: menstrual cramps, anxiety, insomnia, coughs, diarrhea, depression, and the catch-all diagnosis of female troubles. Opritom, pharmacists sold it without prescription, and it was affordable enough that even working-class families could purchase it. Mothers gave it to teething babies. Factory workers took it to endure long shifts. And women, especially women, consumed it in quantities that would shock modern sensibilities. Frugge, the cult of Victorian femininity and female suffering. To understand why laudanum became so deeply entrenched in women's lives, we must first understand the peculiar pressures of Victorian womanhood. The 19th century's ideal woman was delicate, refined, and perpetually on the verge of nervous collapse. She was expected to be the angel in the house, selfless, pure, devoted to her husband and children, and seemingly without physical or emotional needs of her own. This impossible standard created what historians have called a crisis of femininity. Women were corseted so tightly they could barely breathe, denied education and meaningful work, and expected to spend their days in a state of ornamental idleness. Is it any wonder that so many developed genuine physical symptoms? The medical establishment of the time had a conveniently vague explanation for women's suffering: hysteria. This diagnosis, whose name derived from the Greek word for uterus, was a catch-all category for female complaints that doctors couldn't or wouldn't investigate seriously. Fatigue, anxiety, sexual desire, or lack thereof, insomnia, appetite loss, emotional outbursts, all could be attributed to hysteria, that mysterious malady believed to originate in the female reproductive organs. And what was the treatment for hysteria? Why, laudanum, of course. Along with bed rest, isolation from stimulating activities, and the famous rest cure that would later be immortalized in Charlotte Perkins Gilman's The Yellow Wallpaper. Dali Vuantuf, the seduction of opium. For women trapped in loveless marriages, suffocating under the weight of social expectations, or genuinely suffering from untreated medical conditions, laudanum offered something precious: relief. The drug didn't discriminate between physical and emotional pain, it simply made everything feel more bearable. In the early stages of use, laudanum seemed miraculous. It banished menstrual cramps, calmed racing thoughts, and wrapped users in a warm cocoon of contentment. Women who took it described feeling lighter, more capable, less burdened by the endless domestic demands placed upon them. The drug induced a dreamy euphoria, a sense that all was right with the world, even when objective circumstances suggested otherwise. Opium had been praised by poets and writers for centuries. Samuel Taylor Coleridge claimed it enhanced his creativity. Thomas de Quincey wrote his famous Confessions of an English Opium Eater in 1821, describing the drug's pleasures in rapturous detail. Elizabeth Barrett Browning took laudanum throughout her adult life and credited it with enabling her to write. These cultural endorsements gave the drug an aura of artistic respectability, but what these testimonials often glossed over were the darker consequences of long-term use. Gillard. The descent into dependency. The problem with opium, as countless Victorian women discovered too late, is that the body adapts to its presence with remarkable speed. What begins as relief transforms gradually and insidiously into necessity. Within weeks of regular use, the brain's chemistry shifts. The body's natural production of endorphins, those internal opioids that regulate pain and mood, diminishes, leaving users dependent on external sources. This meant that doses that once produced pleasant effects became merely sufficient to stave off withdrawal. And withdrawal from opiates is a special kind of hell. Users experienced violent stomach cramps, uncontrollable vomiting and diarrhea, fever, chills, muscle aches, anxiety, and an overwhelming sense of despair. Victorian women described it as feeling like they were dying, and in their desperation, they would do anything to make it stop, which meant taking more laudanum. The cycle was vicious. Women increased their doses, sometimes reaching quantities that would be considered massive by today's standards. There are documented cases of women consuming several ounces of laudanum daily, amounts that would likely kill an opioid-naive individual. But tolerance to opiates develops not just to their pleasurable effects, but also to their respiratory depressive effects, allowing chronic users to survive on doses that would be immediately fatal to others. Justilis, the symptoms of laudanum addiction. As women sank deeper into addiction, the effects became increasingly visible, even in an age when polite society preferred to look away from uncomfortable truths. The maniacs of our title weren't raving lunatics in the Gothic sense, but women whose behaviour had become erratic, unpredictable, and often disturbing to those around them. Chronic laudanum users exhibited a constellation of symptoms. Their pupils became permanently constricted, giving them a glassy, distant stare. Their skin took on a yellowish pallor. They became chronically constipated, a side effect of opiates that could last for weeks and cause serious medical complications. Many suffered from what was called opium face, a wasted, aged appearance that made women look decades older than their years. But the psychological effects were perhaps even more troubling. As addiction progressed, women became obsessed with obtaining and maintaining their supply. They would lie to doctors, visit multiple pharmacies, hide bottles around the house, and fly into rages when their access to the drug was threatened. The substance that had once made them compliant and dreamy now made them anxious, paranoid, and emotionally volatile. Some women experienced frightening hallucinations, especially as they increased their doses or when they tried to reduce their intake. Others fell into deep, death-like sleeps from which they could barely be roused. There are accounts of women passing out mid-conversation, of mothers neglecting their children, of wives becoming so withdrawn that their husbands considered them mentally ill. The Victorian medical literature is full of case studies that make for grim reading. One doctor described a patient who consumed 8 ounces of laudanum daily and would become violent and unmanageable if denied her dose. Another wrote of a woman so addicted that she would drink the drug directly from the bottle, heedless of the prescribed dose, until she collapsed into unconsciousness. 2. The social conspiracy of silence. What makes the laudanum epidemic particularly tragic is how thoroughly it was hidden. Victorian society prided itself on appearances, on maintaining a veneer of respectability no matter what horrors lurked behind closed doors. Women's addiction was a shameful secret, not to be spoken of in polite company. Families often conspired to hide a mother's or daughter's addiction. They might claim she was suffering from nerves or delicate health explanations that were both true and conveniently vague. Women were sometimes locked in their rooms during particularly difficult periods of withdrawal, their screams and pleas dismissed as hysteria. Doctors, too, were complicit in the epidemic. Many recognized that their patients were becoming dependent on the medicines they prescribed, but they had few alternatives to offer. The germ theory of disease was still in its infancy. Antibiotics didn't exist. Pain management consisted largely of alcohol, opium, or suffering in silence. And many physicians simply didn't take women's complaints seriously enough to investigate underlying causes. It was easier to write another prescription for laudanum than to address the social, medical, or psychological roots of their patients' distress. Some doctors even blamed women themselves for their addiction, characterizing it as a moral failing rather than a predictable physiological response to chronic opiate exposure. The medical literature of the time is riddled with judgmental language about female weakness and lack of self-control, even as doctors continue to prescribe the very substance causing the problem. Shuktazi, famous victims and literary shadows. The laudanum epidemic touched women from all walks of life, but we know most about its effects on those who left written records behind. Elizabeth Barrett Browning's addiction lasted for decades and was known to her close associates, though publicly downplayed. She began taking laudanum after a spine injury in her youth and never stopped. Her letters occasionally reference her struggles with the drug, and some scholars have speculated about its influence on her poetry. Louisa May Alcott, author of Little Women, became dependent on opium after being treated with calomel, mercurous chloride, and opium during a bout of typhoid fever while serving as a Civil War nurse. The mercury poisoning caused lasting health problems, and she continued to use opium for pain relief for the rest of her life. The novelist Wilkie Collins was a heavy laudanum user, and while he was male, his novel The Moonstone features one of literature's most famous depictions of opium-influenced behavior. His female characters often exhibit the languorous, dreamy quality associated with opiate use, and scholars have long suspected he drew on observation of addicted women in his social circle. But for every famous name, there were thousands of anonymous women whose stories have been lost to history. Women whose obituaries mentioned only that they died peacefully at home after a long illness. Women whose families destroyed their letters and diaries to protect the family reputation. Women who simply disappeared into asylums, their addiction misdiagnosed as insanity. The children's tragedy. Perhaps the most horrifying aspect of the laudanum epidemic was its impact on children. Victorian infants and toddlers were regularly dosed with opiate-containing preparations marketed as soothing syrups or quieting medicines. Products with names like Mrs. Winslow's Soothing Syrup and Godfrey's Cordial were advertised as safe remedies for teething pain, colic, and restlessness. Working-class mothers, especially those employed in factories or domestic service, used these preparations to keep their children quiet while they worked. The drugs did indeed quiet the children, sometimes permanently. Infant mortality rates in areas where these syrups were popular were significantly higher than in regions where they were less commonly used. Some babies became addicted in the womb, born to mothers who had used laudanum throughout pregnancy. These infants suffered withdrawal immediately after birth, exhibiting the same terrible symptoms as adult addicts: inconsolable crying, vomiting, seizures, and sometimes death. The gradual recognition of this problem was one of the factors that eventually led to drug regulation in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. But change came slowly, and thousands of children died or suffered lasting damage in the meantime. The business of addiction. Behind the medical tragedy was a commercial bonanza. Patent medicine companies made fortunes selling opiate-based remedies, and they fought fiercely against any attempt at regulation. These medicines were marketed specifically to women, with advertisements that played on Victorian anxieties about female health and propriety. The advertising language was carefully crafted to be both alluring and respectable. Products promised to cure female weakness, to restore nervous energy, to bring peaceful sleep, and relief from suffering. The advertisements often featured testimonials from satisfied customers, women who praised the medicines without mentioning that they had become unable to function without them. Some historians have argued that the patent medicine industry deliberately created dependence. Whether through malice or simply through indifference to the consequences, these companies certainly profited from repeat customers who needed ever-increasing amounts of their products. The lack of regulation meant that preparations varied wildly in strength and purity. A woman might buy a bottle of tonic that contained relatively little opium, become accustomed to a certain dose, and then purchase a new bottle from a different manufacturer that was 3 times as strong. Accidental overdoses were common. The beginning of the end. By the late 19th century, awareness of the opiate problem was growing. Medical journals began publishing articles warning about the dangers of chronic opium use. Reformers started campaigning for drug regulation, and importantly, the development of new medicines provided alternatives to opium for some conditions. The synthesis of acetyl salicylic acid aspirin in 1897 gave doctors a non-addictive painkiller for the first time. Ironically, heroin was also synthesized around the same time and initially marketed as a non-addictive morphine substitute, a claim that proved tragically false. The growing field of psychiatry began to recognize addiction as a medical condition rather than purely a moral failing. In Britain, the Pharmacy Act of 1868 restricted the sale of opium and required that it be properly labelled. The United States was slower to act, but gradually implemented similar regulations. By the early 20th century, opiate addiction was increasingly treated as a problem requiring medical intervention rather than simply moral condemnation. But for many Victorian women, these changes came too late. Those who had spent decades in the grip of laudanum addiction faced a grim choice: continue using the drug that was destroying their health, or attempt withdrawal, a process that was poorly understood and often poorly managed. Some women spent months or years trying to quit, suffering through repeated relapses. Others never managed to stop at all. That is still legacy and lessons. The laudanum epidemic of the Victorian era offers sobering lessons that remain relevant today. It demonstrates how easily a medicine can become a societal scourge when profit motives, medical ignorance, and social pressures align in dangerous ways. It shows how vulnerable populations, in this case, women whose complaints were systematically dismissed, can be particularly at risk for iatrogenic addiction caused by medical treatment. The story also reveals how addiction is often a symptom of deeper problems. Victorian women turned to laudanum not because they were weak or morally deficient, but because they were suffering from untreated medical conditions, from the psychological toll of restrictive social roles, from lives that offered little agency or fulfillment. The drug provided temporary escape from circumstances that were, in many cases, genuinely intolerable. Modern parallels are impossible to ignore. The opioid epidemic that has ravaged much of the developed world in recent decades follows a similar pattern. Aggressive marketing of pharmaceutical opioids, medical professionals prescribing these drugs liberally, vulnerable populations becoming addicted, and belated regulatory responses after tremendous damage has been done. Once again, women have been disproportionately affected, particularly when it comes to prescription drug dependence. The Victorian laudanum epidemic reminds us that addiction is not a modern phenomenon, not a sign of contemporary moral decay or social breakdown. It's a timeless human vulnerability, one that emerges whenever powerful mind-altering substances intersect with human suffering and societal dysfunction. The drugs may change from laudanum to heroin to OxyContin, but the underlying dynamics remain eerily similar. Gia. Conclusion. The women time forgot. The Victorian women who became dependent on laudanum were not maniacs in any clinical sense. They were ordinary people mothers, wives, daughters, sisters, caught in an impossible situation. They were told their suffering was both real enough to require treatment and too insignificant to deserve serious medical attention. They were offered a medicine that seemed miraculous and turned out to be devastating. And they were judged, stigmatized, and forgotten by a society that preferred to look away from uncomfortable truths. Their story deserves to be remembered, not as a cautionary tale about feminine weakness, but as a chapter in the long history of medicine's complex relationship with powerful drugs. It's a story about the dangers of treating symptoms without addressing causes, about the vulnerability of disempowered populations, and about how substances that promise to ease our pain can end up compounding our suffering. The bottles of laudanum are gone from pharmacy shelves now, the Victorian women who depended on them long since dead. But their legacy persists in every conversation about addiction, pain management, and the appropriate role of pharmaceutical solutions to human problems. They were not maniacs. They were casualties of an era that medicalized women's suffering without addressing its roots. And their ghosts should haunt us as we navigate similar challenges today. The drug that supposedly turned Victorian women into maniacs didn't transform them at all. It merely revealed the desperation that had been there all along, hidden behind the facade of respectable middle-class life. And in doing so, it exposed uncomfortable truths about Victorian society that many would have preferred to remain hidden forever.